That morning, sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor as I folded my dress with slow, careful hands. It was my son's wedding day. I told myself this was a moment I had waited for all my life, the reward for years of sacrifice, worry, and quiet love. I looked at my reflection and practiced a calm smile, the kind mothers wear when they do not want to trouble anyone. I never imagined that by nightfall, I would learn exactly how small my place in his world had become. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. I woke up early that morning with a strange mix of nerves and pride sitting heavy in my chest. It was my son's wedding day, and even though I had slept poorly, I moved carefully and quietly through my small house as if the day itself needed to be handled with care. I made a simple breakfast and barely touched it. My mind was already at the ceremony, imagining his smile, the way he used to look at me when he was young and needed reassurance. I told myself this day was about him, not me, and that thought helped me stay calm. I ironed my dress slowly, smoothing each crease as if I were pressing down years of memories along with the fabric. It was not an expensive dress. I had chosen it because it was clean, modest, and familiar. I wanted to look respectful, not noticeable. As the iron steamed, I whispered my son's name under my breath, the way I used to when he was sick as a child or nervous before an exam. Old habits stay with you, even when children grow up and move on. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I expected. I practiced a gentle smile, lifting the corners of my mouth just enough to look proud, but not emotional. I reminded myself not to cry, not to embarrass him, not to draw attention. Mothers learn early how to make themselves smaller when needed. I told myself this wedding was proof that I had done my job well. He was successful. He was confident. He was marrying into a world that looked polished and secure. That should have been enough. As I got ready, my phone stayed silent. I told myself he was busy. Weddings are hectic. There are schedules, photographers, guests, expectations. I didn't want to bother him with questions or requests. I assumed someone would guide me when I arrived. I trusted that there would be a place for me, somewhere close enough to feel included, even if not in the spotlight. I had no reason, at that moment, to expect otherwise. On the drive to the venue, I watched expensive cars pass me on the highway, all heading in the same direction. I adjusted my jacket and checked the invitation again, just to be sure. Everything looked proper. Everything looked official. I felt like I belonged, at least on paper. I parked where an attendant directed me and followed signs toward the entrance, holding my purse tightly, steadying my breathing. The venue itself was stunning. Tall doors, polished floors, soft music floating through the air. People moved with confidence, laughing, greeting one another, dressed in fabrics that caught the light. I stepped inside carefully, aware of my surroundings, careful not to block anyone's path. I looked around, half expecting to see my son searching for me, maybe waving, maybe smiling in relief that I had arrived safely. Instead, a staff member glanced at my invitation and pointed without much thought. I followed the direction given, still calm, still trusting. I told myself that large weddings are complicated and that seating arrangements are not personal. I reminded myself that today was not about comfort. It was about showing up, being present, and quietly supporting my child. As I walked further inside, I noticed how the atmosphere changed depending on where you stood. Near the front, people spoke softly, carefully. Further back, voices were louder, movements quicker. I didn't question it yet. I kept walking, believing that at any moment someone would stop me, greet me, or guide me closer. Even then, I still believed my son would look for me. I believed he would notice if I wasn't nearby. I believed love worked that way. I did not yet understand how easy it is for assumptions to replace care. I did not yet know that silence can be planned, that distance can be intentional and that dignity can be overlooked when it no longer fits the picture someone wants to present. That morning, I was still holding on to hope. I was still a mother expecting recognition. I was still walking forward, unaware that the place I was being led to would quietly change how I saw my son, my role, and myself forever. The wedding hall opened up in front of me like a scene from a magazine. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling, catching every movement and turning it into something soft and glowing. The floors were polished marble, smooth and cold beneath my shoes. Flowers filled the air with a scent that felt expensive, carefully chosen, nothing like the simple bouquets I used to arrange at home. Guests moved easily through the space, laughing, greeting one another with confidence, as if they all belonged here without question. I paused for a moment, taking it all in. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to remember why I was there. This was my son's day. I had imagined this moment for years, though never quite like this. I had pictured warmth, familiarity, a sense of shared history. Instead, everything felt formal, distant, carefully arranged to impress rather than to connect. I followed the aisle slowly, scanning faces as I walked. I looked for someone I knew, someone who might smile or nod in recognition. Most people looked straight past me, focused on their own conversations, their own reflections in glass and mirrors. I reminded myself not to take it personally. Large weddings can make anyone feel invisible, especially someone who does not blend into the setting. Then I saw the seating cards. I stopped when I found my name. It was written clearly, neatly, no mistake about it. The row number was far from the front, much farther than I expected. I hesitated, checking again, thinking I might be reading it wrong, but it was correct. Row 14. I began walking again, counting rows as I went. With each step, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter grew louder, the lighting less soft. The elegance faded into something more functional. When I reached my seat, I finally understood. It was beside the service area. A door stood just a few feet away, opening and closing as staff passed through carrying trays and equipment. I could hear quiet instructions being whispered, the soft clatter of dishes, the sound of work happening behind the scenes. This was not a place meant for family. It was a place meant to be unnoticed. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to sit. I looked around instinctively for my son, hoping he might catch my eye, see where I was, and realize something was wrong. He was near the front, surrounded by people, smiling, laughing, busy. He did not look back. As I lowered myself into the chair, a strange heaviness settled in my chest. It wasn't just disappointment, it was recognition. This was not an accident. Someone had chosen this seat for me. Someone had decided where I belonged in this picture. I smoothed my dress and folded my hands in my lap, trying to keep my posture steady. I watched guests arrive, watched them take their places near the front, watched them greet my son and his bride with excitement and admiration. I watched the way people leaned in toward them, eager to be seen, eager to be included. No one leaned toward me. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The closer you sat to the front, the more you were seen as important, connected, valued. The further back you went, the more you faded into the background. By the time you reached where I was seated, you might as well have been part of the building. I thought about all the times in my life when I had chosen to stand back so others could shine, all the school events where I stayed quiet in the audience, all the celebrations where I worked behind the scenes. I had never needed recognition. I had believed love was enough. But sitting there beside a door meant for staff, I realized something painful. This wasn't about modesty or humility. This was about erasure. As guests continued to arrive, I caught fragments of conversation, compliments about the venue, comments about how perfect everything looked. No one spoke about family. No one asked where the groom's mother was seated. It was as if my presence had already been accounted for and dismissed. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I did not cry. I refused to. I told myself to stay still, to stay composed. I did not want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me uncomfortable. That was the moment when something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. A realization settled in that this wedding was not just about celebrating love, it was about presentation. And in that presentation, I had been placed where no one would notice if I disappeared. I sat there, listening to the soft hum of preparation behind the service door, understanding for the first time that my place in my son's life had been carefully decided without me. I was still trying to steady myself in that chair when I felt someone lean closer. The air shifted beside me, subtle but deliberate, the way people move when they want to speak without being overheard. I turned slightly and saw her face close to mine, perfectly made up, calm, controlled, almost kind at first glance. Her smile did not reach her eyes. It was measured, practiced, the kind people wear when they believe they hold power. Her voice was low, smooth, and careful, as if she had rehearsed the words ahead of time. She told me that my poverty would embarrass them. She said it without anger, without heat, just a simple statement, delivered like a rule that had already been agreed upon by everyone who mattered. Then she smiled again, satisfied, and straightened in her seat as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I could not breathe. The words did not hit me all at once. They moved slowly, sinking in layer by layer, pressing down on memories, on effort, on years I had spent believing I was doing the right thing by staying quiet and small. I felt my chest tighten, my hands grow cold. I stared ahead, afraid that if I looked at her again, I might lose control of my face. What hurt most was not the insult itself. It was the certainty behind it. She spoke as if this was already decided, as if my value had been discussed, measured, and found lacking, as if my presence was a problem to be managed, not a mother to be respected. I glanced instinctively toward my son. He was only steps away, close enough that I could see the way his suit fit him perfectly, the way he stood tall, confident, proud, close enough that he could have noticed, close enough that he might have intervened. He did not look in my direction. He did not turn. He did not react. He continued speaking with guests, smiling, fully present in a world where I apparently did not exist. That silence landed harder than her words. I had spent years telling myself that my son loved me in his own way, that he was busy, that life pulled people in different directions. I had excused missed calls, short visits, distracted conversations. Sitting there, I could no longer pretend. His silence was not confusion, it was a choice. I felt a sharp wave of shame, followed immediately by something else. Anger, perhaps, or clarity. It was the realization that my dignity was being negotiated without my consent, right in front of me, and that no one was stepping in to stop it. I straightened my back and focused on my breathing. I refused to let them see me crumble. I reminded myself that I had survived far worse than a cruel sentence whispered at a wedding. I had survived loss, exhaustion, fear, and years of carrying responsibility alone. This moment would not undo me. Still, the pain was deep. I thought about how carefully I had chosen my dress that morning, how I had made sure it was clean, pressed, simple, how I had worried about being a burden, about drawing attention, about doing something wrong. I had already been trying to make myself smaller. Her words simply confirmed that it would never be enough. Around me, the ceremony preparations continued. Music swelled softly. Guests adjusted their seats. No one noticed what had just been taken from me. That, too, was part of the cruelty. It happened quietly, efficiently, without disruption. My humiliation did not interrupt the celebration. I sat there, absorbing the truth of my position. I was not seen as family. I was a liability, a risk, something to be hidden so the picture would look better. And yet, beneath the shock, another thought began to form, slow, steady, clear. If they believed I was powerless, it was because I had allowed them to. If they believed my worth was tied to what they could see, it was because they did not know my history. They did not know what I had endured. They did not know what I still carried. I kept my face calm. I did not respond. I did not argue. I did not plead. I let the silence sit between us, heavy and unresolved. When she leaned back, satisfied, I remained still, staring forward, feeling something inside me shift. The words she whispered had not broken me. They had exposed something, and once exposed, it could not be ignored. As I sat there, trying to keep my breathing even, my mind drifted backward through years I had not allowed myself to revisit so clearly. The present moment faded, replaced by memories that had shaped my entire life as a mother. I remembered the early days, when my son was small and the world felt heavy on my shoulders. There was no safety net then, no comfort, no one to lean on except my own determination. Everything he became started there, in those quiet years no one ever saw. I remembered the day his college acceptance letter arrived. He was so proud, holding it like a trophy, his eyes bright with dreams bigger than our small home. That night, after he went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my hands for a long time. I knew the numbers. I knew what I earned. I knew it was not enough. So I did what mothers do when love outweighs fear. I took off my wedding ring, the last thing of value I still owned, and sold it the next morning. I never told him where the money came from. I let him believe everything was fine. There were many nights like that, nights where I chose silence instead of complaint, toast instead of a proper meal, shoes with worn soles instead of new ones. I learned how to stretch $1 until it almost tore, and then stretch it further anyway. I learned how to smile when people asked how I was doing, because explaining the truth felt selfish when my child had dreams to chase. I remembered working long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, coming home exhausted but still helping him with homework, still packing lunches, still listening to his worries. I never wanted him to feel the weight I carried. I believed that was my role. I believed that protecting him from struggle was the greatest gift I could give. When he succeeded, when doors opened for him, I stayed in the background. I did not remind him of what it cost. I did not keep score. I told myself that love did not need recognition, that a mother's reward was simply watching her child rise higher than she ever could. Even after he grew older, after he moved on with his life, I continued to make myself small. I declined help. I refused to complain. I dressed simply. I lived quietly. Not because I was ashamed, but because I did not want to be a burden. I believed humility was dignity. I believed silence was strength. Sitting there at that wedding, I finally saw how that silence had been misunderstood. They did not see sacrifice. They saw absence. They did not see restraint. They saw weakness. They did not see love. They saw inconvenience. All those years I had spent teaching myself to stay small had taught them that I was safe to overlook. I thought about the moments when I could have spoken up but chose not to. The times I felt uncomfortable but stayed quiet. The times I sensed distance growing but told myself it was normal. I realized that my silence had protected everyone except me. What hurt most was knowing that my son had grown up watching me endure quietly and had learned the wrong lesson from it. He had learned that my needs were optional, that my feelings could be managed later, that my dignity was flexible. I did not regret my sacrifices. I never would. But I finally understood that sacrifice without boundaries does not always create gratitude. Sometimes it creates entitlement. As these thoughts settled, something inside me shifted. The sadness was still there, but it was no longer hollow. It was solid, grounded, rooted in truth. I was not ashamed of my past. I was proud of it. Every hard choice I made had built the foundation of the life my son now stood proudly inside. And suddenly, the whisper about my poverty felt smaller than it had moments before. not because it hurt less, but because it revealed how little they understood about wealth. They saw money. I saw resilience. They saw status. I saw survival. They saw appearances. I saw the cost behind every achievement. I sat up a little straighter in my chair. My hands stopped trembling. I looked around the room with new eyes, no longer searching for approval. I had given too much of myself to apologize for existing. I had spent my life teaching my son how to rise. Now, for the first time, I allowed myself to stop shrinking. As the ceremony continued, the room around me grew louder, brighter, more alive, while I felt myself slowly fading into the background. Laughter rolled through the rows in front of me. Glasses clinked. Heads leaned together in quiet conversations filled with comfort and belonging. I stayed still in my chair, hands folded in my lap, feeling like a guest who had wandered into the wrong event. No one turned around. No one noticed where I was sitting. That was not an accident. It was design. I looked toward the front where my son stood tall, confident, polished in his tailored suit. He looked successful, admired, respected. People smiled at him like he had always belonged among them. I searched his face, hoping for a glance in my direction, hoping for some sign that he knew I was there, that I mattered in this moment. But his eyes never moved past the front rows. It felt like watching someone I loved through thick glass, close enough to see, too far to touch. Around me, the service door opened and closed quietly. Staff moved back and forth carrying trays, adjusting lights, whispering instructions to each other. The sounds were soft but constant, a reminder of my placement. I was not seated with family. I was placed where movement was expected, where presence was temporary, where people were meant to pass through, not stay. Each time someone brushed past my chair, I felt smaller, more out of place, more invisible. I noticed how guests nearby shifted when they realized I was not part of the group they expected. Some looked at me briefly, then away, unsure how to place me. Others avoided eye contact altogether. I could feel the question hanging in the air around me. Who is she? Why is she here? That question hurt more than the whisper ever could. I told myself to sit still, to behave, to not draw attention. Old habits are hard to break. For years I had trained myself to be quiet, to not inconvenience anyone, to take up as little space as possible. So I did what I had always done. I stayed silent. I kept my posture neat. I smiled gently when someone glanced my way. I acted like this was normal. Inside, something was tightening. As the vows continued, I realized I was not being excluded by accident or oversight. I was being managed, kept at a distance, positioned where my presence would not interfere with appearances. It was not just about money or clothes or status. It was about control, about deciding who belonged in the center and who could be pushed to the edge without consequence. I felt a strange mix of emotions rising at once. Shame tried to surface, but it could not hold. Sadness followed, but it was quickly overtaken by clarity. I understood now that this moment was not about humiliation alone. It was about erasure, about rewriting the story of who mattered in my son's life. I watched guests stand and sit on cue, united, coordinated, comfortable. I stayed seated when everyone else rose, simply because no one near me moved. I stood alone seconds later, awkward and late, then sat down again feeling foolish. That small moment stayed with me. It told me everything I needed to know. My son laughed at something said near the altar. His joy looked real. That was what hurt the most. He was not uncomfortable. He was not conflicted. He was at ease. Somewhere along the way, my absence from his immediate world had become normal to him. I realized then that this wedding was not the beginning of my exclusion. It was simply the first time it was displayed publicly. The room felt colder, not physically, but emotionally. I wrapped my hands together, grounding myself, reminding myself to breathe. I told myself I would not cry here, Not in this place, not in this seat. If tears came, they would come later, somewhere safe. As applause filled the room, I joined in quietly, clapping slowly, deliberately. Not because I felt celebratory, but because I refused to disappear. I would not cause a scene. I would not beg for recognition. But I would remain present, aware, and awake. In that moment, I understood something painful but important. Being quiet had protected my son's comfort for years. Today, it had cost me my place beside him. I shifted in my seat and felt the weight of the moment press down on my chest. My hands rested in my lap, folded the way I had folded them my entire life when I needed to stay calm. I told myself to wait, to be patient, to trust that my son would notice me eventually. I had spent decades believing that love always circles back, that if you give enough, stay quiet enough, wait long enough, the people you love will turn around and see you standing there. I stood once, not to interrupt, not to draw attention. I stood because a mother's instinct does not disappear just because she has been placed in the back. I stood because I wanted him to see me, to look down and register that I had come, that I was present, that I mattered. I stood there longer than was comfortable, my heart beating hard, my breath shallow, my eyes fixed on him. He never looked. His attention stayed forward, locked into the moment, into the applause, into the people who surrounded him now. He smiled, laughed softly, nodded at someone beside him. He looked happy, fulfilled, complete. And in that quiet realization, something inside me cracked. I sat back down slowly, carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter whatever was left holding me together. I felt a pressure in my throat, the kind that comes right before tears. I swallowed it back. Not here. Not now. I had learned long ago how to delay my pain, how to store it somewhere deep until it was safe to feel. As I sat there, I realized this moment was not just about a seat or a whisper or a wedding. It was about years of choices, years of silence, years of believing that being understanding was the same as being valued. I saw with painful clarity that my son had grown into a life where I existed on the margins. Not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of comfort. He had learned to live without looking back. That realization hurt more than any harsh word ever could. I felt grief rise in me, not the sharp kind that comes with sudden loss, but the slow, heavy kind that comes with understanding. I was grieving a version of my son that no longer existed. The boy who used to look for me in crowded rooms. The young man who used to call just to ask if I was okay. The son who once needed me. I wondered when the shift happened. When I stopped being someone he reached for and became someone he assumed would always wait. I wondered how many moments I had swallowed to keep peace. How many times I had chosen quiet so others could stay comfortable. Sitting there, I understood that love given without limits can slowly erase the one giving it. My eyes burned, but I kept them steady. I refused to let anyone see me break. I straightened my back. I lifted my chin. I reminded myself that dignity does not require permission. Even when unseen, it exists. That was the moment I stopped hoping. Hope can be beautiful, but it can also be cruel when placed in the wrong hands. In that seat, beside that service door, I released the hope that my son would suddenly turn around and make this right. I released the hope that silence would be rewarded. I released the hope that endurance alone creates respect. What replaced it was not anger. It was clarity. I understood that I could love my son and still accept that he had failed me in this moment. I could carry both truths without collapsing. I did not need to confront him here. I did not need to speak. The shift had already happened inside me, and once that shift happens, nothing looks the same again. I took a slow breath and felt myself settle. The shaking stopped. The ache remained, but it was quieter now. steadier. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I was choosing myself. As the ceremony moved forward, I stayed seated, composed, present. But the woman sitting in row 14 was not the same woman who had walked in that morning practicing a hopeful smile in the mirror. That woman had been searching for reassurance. The one sitting there now understood something far more important. Sometimes the deepest losses happen quietly. No argument, no confrontation. Just a moment where you realize you are no longer seen. And in that realization, something ends. That was the moment my son lost me. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I stopped disappearing for him. I was still sitting there, steady on the outside and fractured within, when I sensed movement beside me. At first, I assumed it was another member of the staff passing through, another reminder of where I had been placed. But this time, the movement stopped. Someone pulled out the chair next to mine and sat down slowly, deliberately, as if that seat had always been his. I turned my head slightly, careful not to draw attention, and saw a man in a black suit. Everything about him was calm, not rushed, not uncertain. He carried himself with the ease of someone who belonged anywhere he chose to sit. His suit was simple but precise. His posture was relaxed but alert. He did not look at me right away. He faced forward, hands resting loosely, as though we were simply two guests sharing a row like any other. For a brief moment, I wondered if he had made a mistake. People did not usually choose this row. They did not choose seats beside the service door unless directed there. But there was no confusion in his presence. He knew exactly where he was. I felt my shoulders tense, unsure of what to expect. Years of learning to stay unnoticed made me cautious of sudden attention. I braced myself for pity, for awkward small talk, for questions I did not want to answer. But none of that came. Instead, he leaned just slightly in my direction, close enough that only I could hear him, and spoke in a low, even tone. His voice was steady, respectful, free of judgment. He said one simple sentence, nothing more. "Let us pretend we came together." There was no curiosity in his voice, no condescension, no performance, just an offer. A quiet, dignified offer that required nothing from me except acceptance. In that moment, something unexpected happened. The tightness in my chest loosened just a little, not because my situation had changed, but because for the first time that day, someone acknowledged my presence without trying to minimize it. He did not ask who I was. He did not ask why I was there. He did not look at me with confusion or pity. He treated me as though my place beside him made sense. I nodded once. A small movement. Enough. We sat there side by side, facing forward. To anyone watching, we looked like a pair. Not family, perhaps, but connected. Intentional. No longer an afterthought tucked near the door. I noticed the subtle change around us almost immediately. The staff passing by slowed their steps. Guests nearby glanced over and then looked away again, reassessing what they thought they knew. The question of who I was shifted into something else. Who is she with? That distinction mattered more than I expected. The man beside me remained still, composed. He did not fidget. He did not whisper again. His presence alone created a boundary, a quiet shield I had not realized I needed. For years, I had protected everyone else by shrinking myself. Now, without effort, he was protecting me simply by sitting where he chose. I felt a strange mix of emotions rise up. Gratitude, yes, but also grief for how unfamiliar this feeling was. How long had it been since someone had stood beside me without hesitation? How long since I had been treated as someone worth aligning with? As I sat there, I realized this man was not rescuing me. He was reminding me of something I had forgotten. I did not need permission to belong. I did not need to earn my place by being invisible. Presence itself has value when it is claimed. I glanced at him briefly, just long enough to take in his calm expression. He gave no sign that he expected anything in return, no smile seeking validation, no glance checking my reaction. He simply stayed. And in that stillness, I felt myself straighten again, not from pride, but from recognition. I was not alone in that row anymore. I was no longer the woman quietly absorbing humiliation. I was someone seated intentionally, seen by at least one person who understood the weight of dignity. The ceremony continued. Music swelled. Voices echoed softly through the space. But inside me, something shifted again. This time, not from pain, but from balance. I did not yet understand who this man was or why my son would later react the way he did. But I knew one thing with certainty as I sat beside him. For the first time that day, I felt like I mattered. And sometimes, that single moment of recognition is enough to change how the rest of the story unfolds. Time moved strangely after the man sat beside me. Minutes stretched and folded in on themselves, marked only by music cues and polite applause. I did not look at the clock, but later I would remember the exact second when everything changed. At that moment, I was simply sitting still, breathing evenly, aware of the weight of the room and the quiet strength beside me. My son stood at the front, smiling broadly, basking in admiration. From where I sat, I could see the side of his face clearly. He looked confident, settled, certain of his place in the world. This was his moment, his victory lap, the visible proof of a life that had moved far beyond the small home and quiet sacrifices that once built it. Guests leaned forward, phones ready, eyes bright. The atmosphere was thick with celebration. Then, at exactly 1:22:52, something shifted. It began subtly. My son's smile paused, just for a fraction of a second, as if his mind had snagged on an unexpected thought. His eyes moved, not upward or toward his bride, but outward, scanning the rows as though something had drawn his attention without permission. At first, he looked confused. Then his gaze fixed on my row, on me, on the man beside me. I saw the color drain from his face almost instantly. The easy confidence vanished, replaced by a tightness around his eyes, a stiffness in his jaw. His posture changed. Shoulders that had been relaxed moments before pulled inward, as if bracing for impact. This was not surprise alone. It was recognition. He knew the man. That knowledge rippled through him visibly. His breath caught. His lips parted slightly, then pressed together. For the first time that day, he looked unsettled, not by a disruption in the ceremony, not by a forgotten detail, but by the sudden collision of two worlds he had kept carefully separate. The man beside me remained still, eyes forward, expression unchanged. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge my son's stare. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough. My son looked at me next. Really looked. Not the polite glance people give when scanning a crowd, but a focused, searching look. As if he were seeing me for the first time in years. As if he were recalculating everything he thought he knew about who I was, where I belonged, and what I carried with me into that room. The moment stretched. Guests around him began to notice the pause. A few whispers stirred. Someone shifted in their seat. The ceremony did not stop, but something important had already broken through the surface. I did not move. I did not react. I met his gaze calmly, without accusation, without apology. My hands rested quietly in my lap. My face was neutral. I did not need to explain anything. The truth was already doing the work for me. In that second, I understood what he was realizing. He had allowed me to be placed out of sight, assuming no consequences. He had let someone speak to me with cruelty, believing my silence meant safety. He had treated my presence as optional, believing my life was small and contained. And now, in front of everyone who mattered to him, he was confronted with the reality that he had underestimated me. Not because of money, not because of status, but because of connection. The man beside me represented something my son recognized instantly: authority, influence, history, a part of my life he had never bothered to understand. And in recognizing that, he recognized his mistake. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his stance. The smile did not return. The joy of the moment had cracked, replaced by something raw and uncomfortable. Guilt, perhaps. Fear. Regret. It was impossible to tell exactly, but it was clear this realization was not passing. Around him, the celebration continued, but my son was no longer fully present in it. His attention kept drifting back, pulled toward row 14 like a magnet. Each glance carried the same weight: awareness, shame, understanding. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet sense of closure. I had not planned this moment. I had not orchestrated it. I had simply shown up, as I always had, carrying my life with me. The rest revealed itself on its own. The man beside me shifted slightly, crossing one leg over the other, still composed. He did not need to look at me to know the impact he was having. He had offered me dignity earlier. Now, that dignity was undeniable. At 1:22:52, my son lost control of the story he thought he was telling about his life. The narrative he had built, where I existed quietly in the background, unraveled in a single glance. And in that moment, without a word spoken, the balance of power in that room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. After that moment, the room did not return to how it had been. The music kept playing. The ceremony continued. Guests smiled and clapped on cue. But something invisible had shifted, and my son felt it in every breath he took. His body was still standing at the front, but his mind was no longer there. It was pulled backward, caught in a realization he could not escape. I watched him struggle to regain control. He straightened his shoulders again, forced his lips into a careful smile, nodded at the officiant as if everything was fine. But it was not fine. His eyes kept drifting downward, no longer confident, no longer proud. They carried the weight of a truth he had avoided for years. The truth that success does not erase responsibility. The truth that silence can be a choice, and choices have consequences. The guests closest to him began to notice the change. Whispers moved quietly through the rows. Not dramatic, not loud, just enough to ripple the air. People sense discomfort even when they cannot name it. The ease that once filled the room thinned, replaced by a subtle tension. My son felt it, even if no one spoke it aloud. He adjusted his jacket, then adjusted it again. His hands shook slightly as he clasped them together. This was not fear of being exposed publicly. It was fear of being seen clearly. He had built a life where appearance mattered deeply: status, approval, admiration. And now, in the middle of his most important moment, he was confronting the cost of how he had treated the woman who raised him. I realized then that the collapse happening inside him had nothing to do with the man beside me. That man was only the trigger. The real collapse came from memory, from years of being cared for, supported, protected, and believed in. From remembering the hands that fed him, the nights I stayed awake worrying about his future, the quiet sacrifices he had never asked about and never thanked. He had assumed those things were permanent, that I would always be there, patient, silent, forgiving, that my role was fixed, small, and convenient. And now he understood something frightening. I was not small. I had simply chosen not to speak. And silence, once broken, cannot be undone. As the ceremony moved forward, his smile became mechanical. His eyes lost their brightness. He nodded at the right moments, but the joy was gone. He looked like a man holding together a structure that had begun to crack from the inside. Each polite gesture cost him more effort than the last. I did not feel anger watching him. I felt clarity. This was not revenge. This was consequence, no shouting, no confrontation, just awareness settling where denial had lived. He was seeing himself from the outside for the first time, and the image was not flattering. The people around him continued celebrating, unaware of the private reckoning unfolding inches behind his eyes. But I knew, and he knew. That was enough. I thought about how often parents protect their children from discomfort, how often we smooth the edges of their mistakes so they do not feel pain. I had done that my entire life. I had stepped back, swallowed words, accepted less than respect because I believed love required it. But standing there, watching my son falter under the weight of his own choices, I understood something important. Shielding someone from consequences does not make them kind. It makes them careless. My son's success had come at the cost of forgetting where he came from. And now, in front of everyone who mattered to him, he was remembering. Not because I demanded it, not because I raised my voice, but because truth has a way of arriving when it is least convenient. He glanced toward me again, slower this time. There was no confusion now, only understanding and regret. Deep, quiet regret that settled into his posture, his breathing, the way he stood just a little less tall than before. I did not look away. I did not harden my expression. I simply remained present. That presence, steady and unafraid, was more powerful than any accusation could have been. In that moment, my son realized something he could never unlearn. His achievements did not cancel his neglect. His comfort did not excuse my humiliation. And his silence had spoken louder than words ever could. The power in that room no longer belonged to appearances or status. It belonged to truth. And once truth enters a space, it does not leave quietly. That was the moment my son understood that the life he built stood on a foundation he had ignored, and that foundation was me. He found me later, after the ceremony, after the photographs, after the applause had faded into background noise. I was no longer seated in row 14. I had moved to a quiet corner away from the crowd, where the music softened and the air felt lighter. I needed space to breathe, space to think, space to let the weight of the day settle without an audience watching my face. When I saw him walking toward me, I recognized the way his steps slowed. He was no longer the confident groom moving through congratulations and handshakes. He was a son again, unsure, exposed, carrying something heavy that could not be set down easily. His face looked older than it had that morning, not tired, changed. He stood in front of me, struggling to begin. Words gathered and fell apart before reaching his mouth. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to explain, to defend, to apologize, to escape all at once. But none of those options felt complete anymore. What had happened could not be undone by a sentence or softened by emotion. I waited. Not because I needed to hear him speak, but because waiting has always been something I know how to do. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unsteady. He did not sound angry. He did not sound proud. He sounded like someone who had just realized how much he stood to lose. I listened without interrupting, without correcting, without filling the silence for him. That silence was his responsibility now, not mine. I did not argue. I did not recount my sacrifices. I did not list the ways I had been hurt. I had already lived those truths. Repeating them would not give them more meaning. What mattered was that he saw them on his own, without being pushed, without being forced. When he reached for me, I allowed it. I hugged him the way a mother does, not to erase the pain, not to excuse the harm, but because love does not disappear simply because it has been neglected. My arms remembered him even when my heart needed distance. But love does not mean forgetting. I stepped back gently and looked at him, really looked at him. I wanted him to understand something without needing me to say it out loud. That forgiveness does not mean access. That care does not mean compliance. that being someone's mother does not require enduring humiliation in silence. He nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't fully. Understanding sometimes comes in layers, and the deepest ones take time. I left the venue shortly after. No announcement, no scene, just a quiet exit. The same way I had entered his life years ago, without noise, without demands, carrying more than anyone noticed. As the car pulled away, I felt something unexpected, not relief, not triumph, peace, a calm that comes from finally standing in truth without fear of losing approval. I had not won anything that day. I had reclaimed something, my dignity, my voice, my place within myself. In the days that followed, messages came, apologies, explanations, attempts to smooth what could not be smoothed. I responded kindly, but briefly. Kindness does not require proximity, and healing does not require reopening wounds to prove they existed. I returned to my routine slowly. Morning tea, quiet walks, familiar rooms. The world had not changed outwardly, but I had. I no longer measured my worth by how useful I was to others or how invisible I could make myself to keep peace. I understood now that silence can protect love, but it can also protect harm if held too long. I thought often about that seat in row 14, how small it had made me feel in the moment, and how, in truth, it had revealed something powerful. You can place someone at the back of the room, but you cannot place them beneath their own worth unless they allow it. I do not know what my son will carry forward from that day. That is his journey. What I know is what I carry: clarity, boundaries, and a quiet strength that does not need permission to exist. This is what I learned, and what I leave with anyone listening. A mother's love is deep, patient, and enduring, but it is not a license for disrespect. Silence is generous, but it is not endless, and dignity, once reclaimed, becomes a form of freedom no one can take away. I walked away from that wedding not as a woman who had been diminished, but as one who finally chose herself.